All right, I think we should probably go ahead and get started. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Sylvia Tuborowski and I'm a facilitator with Kearns and West, and I'll be helping to facilitate the Rulemaking Advisory Committee meetings. And to begin, I'm just gonna hand it over to Commissioner Lelack to start us with some opening remarks.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. Welcome everyone, RAC members, alternates, community members watching, everyone that's participating in this meeting. It's great to have you here. Welcome back to our second meeting. We are making progress and we're gonna make a lot more today. Really thanks so much to the DLCD and consultant teams. They put in a ton of effort for us this morning. So thank you, we look forward to that. And thank you to all of you who attended our first meeting for your rich guidance based on your professional and lived experiences in diverse communities, across our state, across Oregon. We will loop back in on that today, and as we have a very full agenda, as you are well aware. As one of two commission liaisons to the RAC, I wanted to assure you that the entire commission's commitment to the process remains strong, is strong. Everybody's watching this very closely and carefully, and I certainly look forward to, and I know we all look forward to Commissioner Stuart Warren joining us as a second commission liaison in January. So that'll be terrific to have him participate and join us as well. You have all been specifically chosen based on your geographic representation, lived and professional experiences and interests, and we are so sincerely pleased that you're here participating in this effort. This effort will build on our 2018 work. Most of you should have some familiarity with that at this point, which is great. You will see some of that today in the regional planning discussion and certainly at our upcoming meetings. In summary, LCDC is committed to implementing Governor Brown's executive order, which you've all read, on reducing greenhouse gas pollution. And we look forward to this RAC helping us advance a set of rules and achieve equity and climate goals concurrently. So thank you very much. Welcome again, and I will turn it back to Sylvia. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And just a reminder to everyone that this meeting is being recorded and will be posted to the DLCD website. It's also being live streamed, and I believe someone from staff can put links in the chat with where those are going to live. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Director Jim Rue.
Thank you, Sylvia. Again, Jim Rue, Director DLCD. Thank you to all of you for being here. This is really important work. It's hard work. It's going to take an enormous amount of effort, but I think the payoff is going to be huge. In fact, I would argue that in some ways it already is paying off for this agency at least. I want to spend 5 minutes max talking about the governor's recommended budget to the agency and implications for this RAC and the work that you're doing, as well as other work at DLCD. So for those of you who have not had to dive into the arcana of state budgeting, we start off with our agency recommended budget. That goes through a process. It eventually gets melded into the governor's recommended budget, which she published or released on the 1st of this month. That, of course, forms the basis for the conversation in the legislature, which will kick off on the 19th of January. And will get finalized over the course of the session. But we're really pleased with the starting point because the governor has recognized the importance of this work, has recognized the importance of the nexus of transportation and housing, They're the same thing, really. Housing choice and transportation choice are critical to us reducing greenhouse gases and allowing for more housing, more equitable housing. And so that's really the focus of our work now and going forward is equity, climate, transportation, and housing. And specific to transportation, we asked for $1 million in our request budget to work with communities to get ready for whatever it is that you all prepare. So you all are working on a rule. That rule seeks to provide transportation options, but also importantly to reduce greenhouse gases. Working with ODOT, ODOT has committed to us and to this work $6 million over 5 years to do some of the data and underlying science. And we will use the $1 million, presuming that we get it, in the governor's recommended budget to do community engagement, to actually work with MPOs and local governments to prepare them for the changes that are coming. We're not suggesting they're not going to be without controversy, perhaps maybe some pain, but ultimately for the good of all Oregonians and beyond. And so it's really important work. We will continue working on our housing rules, the fourth of which was passed by our commission, LCDC, last week. And to note the intersection, one of those rules, of course, calls out parking. And it makes very clear the intersection between housing and transportation and options for where people can live. We're also working on climate adaptation, particularly focusing on a vulnerability analysis, taking a look at the effects of a warming climate on those populations who have contributed least to the problem, but are often most affected by a warming climate. And so we're going to be doing that vulnerability analysis over, we hope, the course of the first year of the new biennium. And then just two quick things. The governor, as many of you know, assembled the Racial Justice Council to give input not only on the budget, but also to form an ongoing conversation with the enterprise as a whole about how to address historic inequities, how to make sure that we are bringing people into the conversation who've never had access before. And so the Racial Justice Council suggested two things to us. One was they recommended $1 million to work on a rural transportation initiative. Many of you are very aware of the fact that transportation options in the rural parts of Oregon are limited at best, often limited to a single mode, and that being ICE cars. And so we need to take a look at that. We also need to think about bringing some innovation to transportation at the same time, helping to revitalize rural communities, particularly cities, as they not only try to revitalize their town centers, but also do it in a way that provides transportation options. And the last thing, because I think I'm at 4.5 minutes, is the Racial Justice Council also recommends $850,000 to DLCD to take a look at including environmental justice and climate justice into all of our goals. All of our 19 planning goals should center on equity in a way that they have not before, but with a particular focus on EJ and CJ. And so we hope to be talking to many of you as we kick off that effort. We hope soon after the 1st of July of 21. So with that, unless there are any questions, thank you for your time. And back to Sylvia.
Thank you, Director. Appreciate that update from the Governor's office and that level of commitment to dealing with climate pollution and linking it to equitable communities. So thank you for that. Before we kind of kick into what's going to be a lively agenda today, just want to go over our meeting purpose and agenda and why we're all here at our Rulemaking Advisory Committee meeting number 2. So thank you all for coming back. We had a great discussion at RAC number 1, and here at RAC number 2, we're going to focus on 2 key items. One is review of equitable outcomes for climate-friendly and equitable communities, rulemaking process, and then the other is looking at regional planning and scenario planning. And so at the beginning of our meeting today, Kirsten Green will review the proposed equitable outcomes. So if you remember at our first meeting, you all gave great input as to what you would want to see on the ground in terms of equitable outcomes. And so we'll review that and hope to get your comments and get closer to a document that reflects what you would want to see on the ground. And then we'll have an opportunity to get an overview of regional scenario planning and have some discussions on how best to support coordination at the regional level and kind of talk about best practices for community engagement at the local level. So those are the big chunks of our agenda today, and we'll fit a break in there at some point as well. And you should have all received a meeting packet or 2 meeting packets, and I just kind of want to go over a few key things there because you're still kind of new to getting the meeting packets and sifting through them for these meetings. So first thing, you received a meeting summary as part of your packet, and that's a draft summary. And, you know, if you see anything in there that you want to be corrected or see any errors or something that didn't get represented correctly, please send any comments to Ingrid, who's in the meeting right now, within about a week. Otherwise, they'll just be kind of considered final. And in the first summary, you'll notice that there were comments attributed to specific RAC members. That won't happen going forward. I think with the richness of the conversation that first time and sort of that roundtable discussion, we wanted to make sure we were capturing the uniqueness of everything that was being said, but going forward, it'll be more of a summary format. Also in your packet, there was a list of Rulemaking Advisory Committee members, as well as kind of your perspective as staff understands it. If you would like your perspective to be listed in another way, please feel free to let let the department staff know, and they can make those changes. So again, send any changes to Ingrid. And also in your packet, you received some public comment, and you also received a supplementary packet with additional public comment. So members of the public who are listening today, just note that public comment will be shared with the Rulemaking Advisory Committee when it's sent in, but we ask that it be received 3 business days before a RAC meeting to make it into that RAC packet. Otherwise, if it's received kind of the day before a RAC meeting, it might go into a packet for the next meeting, just due to kind of logistics of pulling all of that stuff together. And we also hope that RAC members can give a scan to all of those public comments, and the LCDC Commission will also be reading them thoroughly. And last thing in your packets that's really important to note is the discussion questions worksheet. So you'll be getting that with every packet. That's just a really good place to go. I just got some muting there. That discussion question sheet is a really good place to just anticipate what's going to be talked about at the next RAC meeting. So good to look at that, to collect your thoughts and think about what you might want to say at RAC meetings. And then after each of these meetings, there will also be a follow-up survey with the same or similar questions so that you can provide more input. And those discussion worksheets really are meant for RAC members to review and provide input on. Members of the public are welcome to provide comments via email, and I think we can put that email address in the chat here, but the discussion worksheets themselves are meant for the RAC members. And a few more process reminders before we kick it off. I know it's a lot this morning, but we want to make sure everyone understands kind of how this process is working. So we appreciate alternates that have been attending the RAC meetings, and you are welcome to take those kind of post-meeting surveys as well. And I think if you're in the meeting, we encourage you to use the live stream if your RAC primary member is in the meeting as well. Another reminder that the meeting is being recorded and live streamed, and all of that will be going on the website. And then a few kind of just participation tips for RAC members in the room today. When we get to our discussion periods, we're going to be doing some breakout sessions. So just kind of be looking for getting into those breakout rooms. And both in the breakout rooms and in the large group discussion, we just encourage you to kind of raise your hand to get in the chat when we get into discussion periods, which you can do by finding the raise your hand button on the platform, or if you're by phone only, just press *9. And if you have any troubleshooting issues, you can send a chat message to the host or to a co-host. I think your best bets are John, Ingrid, or Casaria. And we encourage chat really just for troubleshooting, not for kind of substantive comments. We really want to have a discussion. We encourage you also to use video when possible to promote this face-to-face communication that we can't do in person, unfortunately. And also, we know this is a large chunk of your day. We're going to try to build in a break, but please do get off your video if you need to take a quick break. And I think that is all. So I will hand it over now to Kevin to just give some brief introductions from the department team.
Thanks, Sylvia. Bill, oh, perfect. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm Kevin Young. I'm one of the co-project managers for this effort. The area that I'm working in is housing and urban development, so that side of the puzzle. But I also want to introduce the rest of the staff members. You've heard a lot of names already this morning. So as you can see, it takes a lot of folks to stand this effort up. We're doing this sort of with existing staff, so we're getting people's time as it's available for this effort. So first up, Ingrid Caudell is our administrative support person. So she's the person who's sending you packets, meeting invites. If you have any comments about any changes to the minutes from last meeting, please send those to Ingrid. And I saw that Casaria had put those in the chat. So Ingrid is a key member of our team. Also, Matt Krall, our provides project oversight or direction for us. He's the Planning Services Division Manager. John Dunsmore is our wizard behind the scenes, who's keeping this meeting functioning, the live stream happening, and all that great stuff that is completely beyond somebody like me. So thank you, John. Samuel Garcia is working with us on engagement support. He has been working on the housing initiatives and is now spending some of his time with us on this project as well. Stacy Goldstein is also working on supporting our community-based organization representatives in this effort. She's done a lot of great work on putting this RAC together. So thank you to Stacy. Kirsten Green, you'll be hearing from after me. She's our deputy director and has been very, very involved in this effort. Bill Holmstrom is the other co-project manager. His expertise is in land use and transportation. Brian Hurley is also joining us. He is with the ODOT Climate Office and is kind of our key liaison with ODOT. Evan Manvel is also a member of the Transportation Growth Management team, and his role with us will be on policy and engagement support. Cody Meyer is our land use and transportation expert. You'll be hearing from him later in the meeting about scenario planning. Amanda Peets is joining us today as well. She is the director of ODOT's Climate Office and a key player in the work that we're doing. Ashley Smith is also joined us from the Oregon Department of Energy. She will be providing the meeting summaries for us. So thanks to Ashley for that important work. Casaria Taylor is our rules coordinator. And so she will make sure that once we get to drafting rules, we do those properly and timely. And there are many other things that she does, but that is a key component. One other person that we couldn't fit on this slide, Palmer Mason, is not able to join us today, but I think we will be seeing him a little later. He is a senior policy advisor with DLCD and our sort of liaison with the legislature. And so as things evolve, I think we'll hear from him as well. So I think with that, I will turn it back to Sylvia.
Thank you, Kevin. And during our first RAC meeting, we got a chance to kind of go around the table and do introductions and hear from everyone. And with this 40-person group, it's hard to do that every meeting. But we do want to at least have a moment to acknowledge folks that weren't able to make it to the first RAC meeting. And so I would ask people that weren't able to introduce themselves at the first meeting to just kind of quickly let us know your name, where you are, and a few quick words about what motivated you to join this RAC. And I think I see Francisco Ibarra, Rebecca Descombes, and Simeon Jacob that are new here that weren't here last time. So I'll ask you all to introduce yourselves. And if I missed anyone that's a primary RAC member, go ahead and raise your hand in the platform so we can call on you as well. But Francisco, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. And
Thank
good morning, everybody. My name is Francisco. I'm currently a second-year master's student in the Masters of Urban and Regional Planning program at Portland State. So for me, this is really part of my field and part of my professional and personal interests. So I'm really happy to be here and help, build rules that could really bring us, climate-friendly and equitable cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Rebecca?
Hi, my name is Rebecca Descombes. I am Inuit Eskimo, originally from Alaska. I have been working with Maya Family Center since 2018 and work as a health and environment policy coordinator. I wanted to jump in, work with RAC because I have always been, my family has always worked in environmental and climate issues, coming from an area where climate changes, we see it every day in our subsistence way of life and whatnot. So it was really cool to jump on here. It's nice to meet all of you. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks, Rebecca. And then Simeon and Lee.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Simeon Jacob. I use he and they pronouns. Calling with APANO, which is the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon. I'm their lead environmental justice coordinator. Yeah, with us, we recognize like the intersection of transportation and housing, and this felt like a very important table to complement the community organizing that we do there in the Jade District in Portland. So I'm glad to be able to be in this space with y'all.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lee Helfand. I use they, them pronouns. I am the organizing director with Opal Environmental Justice Oregon here in Portland. And I think the conversations we're going to be having are the most important for what it means for not only our futures, but every day in the communities that I organize with, including the Youth Environmental Justice Alliance and Bus Riders Unite.
Perfect. Thank you. And thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. And Kirsten, I will turn it over to you did you have a couple of announcements this morning?
No, thanks. I think we can head into the slideshow if Bill's willing to help bring it up and run it so I don't flow it up here. But as we get into those discussion groups, maybe we should hear which RAC members are represented by an alternate today, so that John would know that in Caesarea. Anyone? If not, that's okay.
Helpful.
Yes, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself then. This is Randy. I'm Randy Tucker. I'm Metro's Legislative Affairs Manager, and I'm subbing for Margie Bradway today.
Thanks, Randy. I wondered, anyone else? Appreciate you making it. We have a lot to learn from the Portland Metro region, who's gone through scenario planning with our climate smart communities. So thanks for being ahead. Okay, so just reminding us we're all in the right room for the right issue of the day. There's, wildfire recovering going on, a global pandemic going on. So thank you for finding time to join the state on this. Governor Brown issued executive order in the early days of the pandemic, actually in March, which directed several state agencies to work together to achieve our state's greenhouse gas reduction goals that have been on the books for a while, but we are not making the right kind of progress, and that was covered in RAC 1. So Cody will touch on this a little bit later, but I just wanted to mention this as sort of our benchmark. We need to meet our reduction targets. We need to work in metropolitan areas to do that regionally. Talk about that a bit today, and we need to support our regions to be able to do that. We're all one community in Oregon here, so got to pull together, and then find means to and financial and technical assistance to implement those strategies. So Bill, please, if you don't mind, the next slide. So Governor's executive order listed those first suite of communities as priority populations being subject to particular harm and vulnerabilization by climate change. So being made vulnerable by historic inequities and compounded by climate change. You can see the list there, but Native Americans, communities of color, rural communities, etc. All of those are important. Jim also mentioned these other communities traditionally underrepresented in public processes. DLCD also took an initial programmatic approach this past spring and defined the agency's priority populations as a working draft that will be going on as next year as we implement our diversity, equity, inclusion work plan led by Evan and Samuel, actually. But our initial approach named Black, Native American, people of color, people with limited English proficiencies, people living with disabilities, and people living in a situation without homes as priority populations at the outset for the work we do as sort of help us direct our focus, our efforts in the 21st century. Next slide, please. So as you all know also, the 8 regions, so Cody will touch on this as well, but as mentioned, Portland metro area has done their climate smart communities work as a region. And now it is our task to support other regions to do similar work and develop strategies to meet greenhouse gas reduction goals so future ecosystems and communities can survive and thrive on this planet. So when we were looking at the refinements on priority population, we looked at the demographics in these 8 metropolitan areas. So we offer the staff refinements to priority populations, people with lower incomes, renters, and defining the communities of color by metropolitan area, which in Oregon is also really shows up strongly with Latino, Latinx, Latina community members, as well as Asian Pacific Islanders, in addition to the populations mentioned above. The commission, as we took this to commission to help ask them to help us define our work, they added single parents as a community of concern, undocumented community members, thinking specifically, this is an underlying condition, of course, in Oregon, but particularly adversely impacted by the fires and the displacement in Southern Oregon and other areas. And then also LGBTQ and other identifying community members, particularly with respect to safety concerns in urban areas or anywhere. So that is, go ahead with the next slide, Bill, if you don't mind. Those are, you saw those in the draft Equitable outcomes page. We just sort of have that as our kind of community lens. It is subject to discussion today, and we really would like to get to the equitable outcomes. So as we kind of query you on how much work we have to do on these, we think there's actually quite a bit of work to do. I want to truly commend Stacy Goldstein for pulling aside from her existing full-time workload to look at the results in depth of our meeting at RAC 1 and develop these draft statements. We've heard from community members and a member of the RAC that 2 things are missing. We know that green infrastructure, we did not emphasize that enough, as well as the access to culturally appropriate food. Those are both really important as we think about climate-friendly areas and what healthy communities look like. So we would invite RAC's participation today. We're going to stop talking and turn the mics over to you in full group here, and then also in some discussion groups where staff are ready to record, scribe, and put back the equitable outcomes to the RAC for consideration, final consideration at RAC 3. And if it turns out that we do need another work group on this, we would invite city representatives as well as those representing community-based organizations to kind of workshop this with us as staff, and Commissioner Lelack has volunteered to workshop with us in the weeks of really after the new year, the week of January 4th or the very beginning of January 11th, because our packet for our next RAC meeting goes out on January 15th. So the whole process is under a quick clip. Everyone's aware of the urgency of climate change, so we're sort of meeting that, but it is a speedy process. So do stay in touch with staff, your staff liaisons. If there's anything you need through this, or if you just want a one-on-one conversation, like I just don't understand what the scenario planning is, if you want a detailed walkthrough with Cody, he's available for that. Bill, Kevin, others, we're all available to help kind of make sense of what this state rubric is, because it has been around for a decade and will continue to evolve. So, you have these in your packets. This is sort of the third section of the document. I did go into our closed state office building and printed this out. So I don't have a printer at home, and I suspect that's the case for most of you. So we wanted to put this on the screen, and it'll be on the screens in our discussion groups. I think the thing we didn't put on the screen actually is this second section. Sorry, I missed that, where it's the section that reads, "We are building a future where." And this is a bit of sort of a vision statement, but I cringe when I say that, having supported communities to develop many vision statements over the years. They're often in the kind of the 20-year horizon and do provide that sort of end state. What are we aiming for? But we all know that we don't want to wait 20 years. So we just decided to write, we're building a future where all persons and families live in healthy neighborhoods, have access to clean water and have quality housing, et cetera, systemic and institutional inequity based on race, income, and ability no longer exist. So these are some bold statements about the places we want to live, the world we want to live in. And then the items shown on the screen, A through M, are the equitable outcomes we'd like to spend the bulk of our time on today, both in kind of quote unquote plenary and full group, but also in the discussion group, so we can hear from more of this robust and really esteemed advisory committee. So I think with that, Sylvia, I think that we are going to actually poll. We're going to try and run our first poll of RAC members and see how close we are to these outcomes reflecting the will of the RAC. And as discussed at RAC 1, but we know that not all members were on with us at RAC 1, but it really is the bulk of like, does this look what we talked about? Does this look like a good lens through which we can develop monitoring and measurement? So that's the question. Sylvia, back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. And John, I think you can go ahead and launch that poll. And like Kirsten said, the intent in drafting the equitable outcomes was to reflect what was said at RAC 1. Staff knows they probably didn't get it 100% correct, but we want to hear from you. How closely do you think this set of equitable outcomes resembles what was discussed at RAC 1 and really your desired equitable outcomes? So we'd appreciate it if you could just let us know here, does it not at all closely or not closely match your desired outcomes, adequately or relatively closely or very closely? And if you have problems with the poll or don't see it on your screen, just send a chat message to Casaria, Ingrid, or John, but it looks like folks are participating, so we'll just give you a few more seconds here until we get most participants in the poll. And I should also note, this is a straw poll. This is not the final answer for anyone that's feeling a little bit nervous. It's just kind of trying to get a gauge of how well these statements are starting to mesh with what you want to see.
And Bill, you could also advance to the next slide. There's 2 pages of those outcomes. There's a lot, A through M. How many is that? 13 outcomes.
Looks like we're at 77%. I'm not sure how much longer you want me to leave it open.
Perfect. I think we could probably go ahead and end it because staff isn't participating. So that's probably.
Although I wanted to stare at that for a second. I might, if someone could screenshot that and put it in our Google document, I appreciate it. But so it's actually better than I thought. The more I thought about it, there's no way we're going to get this right. So thank you for your gracious sort of commendation that we're on generally the right track, but there are a few members that said not closely. And I think before we go into the breakouts, Stacy, we wanted to hear from those folks if they're willing to kind of share like where we missed the mark, just framing for the whole group. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. So if you did say not closely, or even if you did say more closely, but have, you know, a really big comment that you would like to make with the whole group here, if you want to just raise your hand and let us know what do you think could be improved to make these equitable outcome statements reflect what you want to see on the ground or what this RAC is interested in seeing, we would really appreciate hearing that. I know it can take some effort to be brave and get your hand up and make that comment, but we'd appreciate hearing from anyone that has an idea here. So let's see, I see Michael's hand up. You want to go ahead and a reminder to just say your full name and who you're with, because we're all still getting to know each other. So Michael, go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So my name is Michael Sporluk, and I am an independent consultant doing work primarily on disability rights. I've done a fair amount of work on issues related to housing, and I think that's one of my major comments about this list is that I think we need to move beyond just looking at affordable housing. And I've made this point earlier, we need to look at what constitutes adequate housing, which means not just looking at how much money people have to pay for the apartment or the house that they live in, but everything related to where the house or apartment is in terms of location, in terms of access to services, in terms of how accessible the house is. There are 7 elements of housing that were informed by the UN Economic and Cultural Commission. And I think that we need to adopt those 7 elements. So it's location, affordability, access to services, accessibility, security, tenure, cultural adequacy, and inhabitability. If I can't say that right, whether or not it's habitable. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And then I see hands up from Bandana, Kari, and Julie. So Bandana, go ahead.
I know you went through the list of, you wanted us to talk about the outcomes, but I was also just looking at the list of historically marginalized communities, and age is not included in that. And, you know, working for ARP, I am not saying that age is necessarily just makes us automatically vulnerable, but when you look at it intersectionally, it does. And I'm not talking just about age with people 65 plus, but also younger people. So I would really argue that age needs to be part of that. And I think just generally in the vision part, I would love to see inclusion of age and ability in the description. I think one of the people who submitted comments had proposed some language around that. And I think that was really good place to start. So that's about it.
Thank you. And Kari.
Morning, Kari Schlosshauer with the Safe Routes Partnership. Definitely building off of Michael and Bandana's comments, I think those are both definitely things that I was wanting to consider. And I also wanted to say, I feel like we talked a lot about the need for affordability and accessibility were the 2 things that I had listed here as not seeing reflected in the language throughout this section. And then I think the other piece that jumped out at me, and I think frequently jumps out at me in some of these processes, is just being really intentional about the language that we're using around words like should, and making sure that we're not from the beginning building in any loopholes that would be able to be unimplementable in the future, that we really, we're here to really make sure that these things do happen, and that we need to, I think, include stronger language there. Related to that, I think that, there's a real question for me about we've listed a number of things here, but how do we actually measure these? How do we make sure that we know when we've succeeded? And I definitely am not seeing that in this statement. And I think that that's a place that we really want to make sure that we're starting from on a strong foot as we get into this process. Thanks.
Thank you, Kari. And Julie?
Hi, I was just Julie Warnicki, Transportation Planning Manager with the City of not Springfield, sorry, Salem. At the risk of sounding uneducated, there are a number of terms used in this list of outcomes and phrases that I don't understand. I think maybe some of them come from the equitable community area. I know I use jargon in transportation planning, but you're not showing the ones in particular on the current slide 2, but I think on slide 1, there might have been the use of intersectionality and a few other things. So I'm hoping that, I guess let's see, it was D and E in particular, that I'm hoping we can use language that everybody can understand.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks, Julie. And the number of hands went up. So let's see, Bill, and then Oriana and Lee.
Hi, Bill Graup, Oregon School Boards. I was just following up with Kari's thing as well as my own thoughts that there's nothing, the one reason I said it was slightly less, but it's because there's no measurements for accountability on where this rolls out. There is an assess your previous thing, but no real mention of how the metrics and how that gets reported out, and certainly afterwards the need for accountability and reporting back to the communities that the rules are affecting or the plans are affecting, that it needs to have some form of measurements there that need to be documented.
Thank you, Bill. And Oriana.
Thanks, Sylvia. I want to start just by echoing Bandana's comment about including age justice as part of our metrics for community, because I think it's an important issue around seniors, but also for youth too. And I know Lee from Opal will be speaking next, but just want to give a shout out again to the Youth Environmental Justice Alliance and the work they're doing in particular around transportation and affordable transportation for youth, which I think is a big part of an equitable climate, and not just for youth, but like affordable and free or fearless transit for all folks. But acknowledging that that's primarily coming from youth activism right now. The other thing I wanted to raise is looking through this list, it's very focused on outcomes, but not necessarily on process. And I think what's missing for me here is like how our frontline communities or environmental justice communities being centered in process and given power over decision making. This still feels like a system, and I'm just thinking back to comments I think in particular that Amy and others made last time, and apologies if I'm misattributing here, but just kind of about like mistrust in this sort of government process. And a lot of that comes from the inability to truly influence outcomes. And I don't see that being built in here in a way that feels meaningful, that communities should be leading this work and setting priorities and defining what outcomes should be. And I think we're taking a step towards that through this work, but it can't just be in this kind of space, but really has to be built into our intentionality for how this work looks moving forward, and really shifting power to the communities who are most impacted to shape what their communities look like and how this work is done. Thank you.
Thank you. And a lot of these comments are really centering on measuring and metrics and sort of the process piece. And those are all really critical. And I also do want to point out that will be discussed a little bit later today and will be coming through in the rules. So this isn't the only place where that will pop up, but of course, really important to flag it here. And then let's see, Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, hello again, everyone. Just building off some of the comments that were just made and elevating those. I similarly am not seeing how we think about like process and accountability, and how we think about like access to resources. I think it's important to discuss outcomes in terms of the process here, because we need to be consistently measuring that and using that as a way to guarantee that we are in conversation with community members, that we are resourcing those conversations, and that those conversations are ongoing, that they're not just kind of touch points, but that communities really feel invested in these processes as well. And I also just want to say that I think we need to specifically name something about how we move resources in this process. I think these are really great, and I really appreciate all the work all of you did when I wasn't able to make it here last meeting. But I also am just curious how we can think about some of the hurdles that we'll be confronting in these outcomes and implementation, and how we can kind of get ahead of that by building that into the outcomes. So thinking about how we need to not just like say these different points, because I think many of these things have been said before in many different spaces. And so we need to be a little bit smarter about thinking about how we support this and resourcing this in an ongoing way as well.
Thank you, Lee. Appreciate that. And I saw some other hands up, but somehow they disappeared. But I also wanted to say that we were hoping to, or did they not disappear for others? Oh, Noel, I can see your hand is still up. So go ahead, Noel.
Oh, just a quick comment. Sylvia, you had mentioned metrics and measurement, but I'm hearing from Lee, like in terms of resources, or Oriana and Carrie, a sense of like the importance of having a sense of scale. And so I'm the board member from Oregon Smart Growth, and Oregon Smart Growth is the group that develops most of the housing in Portland or in Oregon these days. And so like from a sense of scale, the city of Portland, just within the city itself, has about $1 billion of new funds every year creating housing. And over 90% of that is always coming from the private sector, which is the pensions, the Wall Street. So if we like devise a solution and like, you know, celebrate $100 million program that's going to impact the economic system, that's $1 billion per year system, we're not going to have any impact, right? And so it's a sense of scale that I really want to underline in order to ensure we have some equitable outcomes, because I think we have to have a commitment to making true change and being honest about the scale of systems that we need to shift in order to be truly equitable in our statement.
Thank you.
Hey, Sylvia, do
And
you have
some of
more
those,
hands?
go ahead.
This is Kirsten. I didn't know if we had more hands. I think I would like to just hear, sort of deepen the conversation in smaller groups, because it's awesome to hear from 8 of us, but there's 40. So, and the 8 are leaders, and you're all, you know, leaders too. We want to hear your voices. So if it's okay, I would say we go ahead and just sort of deepen that. These are great though. We've been writing and recording, and we'll be listening to the audio. So valuable, and definitely our staff too have been talking about measures from day one. How are we going to measure our progress against our actual greenhouse gas reduction targets? So that is a key question. Also, how are we going to measure on the outcomes that you all are describing here? So I just want to affirm that the process, we're going to get to that later in the agenda. What does good community-based engagement look like at the local level? What does it look like at the regional level? So thank you for being on board to help us flesh these things out. We share those questions. I just wanted to, if I can, I put it in the chat, but just real quick, I'm really taken with Lee's point about distribution of resources. And if it's okay, I'm going to actually share my screen really quick, which is a resource I put in the chat, but Governor Brown also came out, I think in May, with her an amazing document from the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion under Silporn Chang's leadership. This is a document about COVID response and equity, but it also, so it obviously was started before COVID because it's a very robust document and framework. In it, she defines diversity, equity, and inclusion for the enterprise. And I think we'll see these as we get back to some, as we hear some guiding principles from the Every Mall Counts community work as it comes back. I know they're centering the guiding principles work on on this language here. But you can see in her definition of equity that it also describes that equity actionably empowers communities most impacted by systemic oppression and requires the redistribution of resources, power, and opportunity to those communities. So we take this to heart as a jumping off place at DLCD. We all work for the governor at the state. So I just wanted to share that resource and acknowledge and support kind of what Lee was saying. This isn't, we can't correct the inequities today by doing business as we did it in the past heretofore. So with that, Sylvia, back to you to kind of get us organized if people are willing to deepen the discussion in smaller groups.
Perfect. Thank you, Kirsten. Yeah, let's go ahead and, well, in a moment, we'll get into smaller groups. And this has been really good to kind of hear the overarching comments and ideas. And I think in the smaller groups, we can delve deeper into what's been said and also get new ideas. And really, we want to use these breakouts to hear from your perspective what changes can be made to better reflect what was said at RAC 1 and your desires for equitable outcomes in the equitable outcomes document. And so we'll get into breakout rooms, and we have a staff leader in each one. We have 6 breakout rooms, and we'll share the screen with the equitable outcomes statements, so you don't have to have memorized them, and hope to just kind of hear from more of you in those breakout rooms. And let's maybe, I would suggest we stay in breakout rooms until about, I know this sounds crazy, but 10:13, John, because John's going to be bringing us back when they're done. And then when we come back, we will do some report out. So we'll ask folks to volunteer to do a really brief report out, just like a 2-minute highlight of what was said in your discussion group. And staff will also be taking notes. So this is all getting captured, and not everything will need to be said in the report out. So I think with that, John, why don't you go ahead and break us out into our groups, and then we will all regroup at 10:13. And if you get lost, there will be John and Ingrid will be in the plenary session, so they can help direct you to where you need to go.
And it's just
okay,
going to take
John.
It's just going to take me a few minutes to get everybody moved where they're supposed to be. So give me a few minutes.
It's a good time to take a sip of water or stretch. And as folks are getting in our breakouts, if folks need bathroom breaks and stuff, please do just evaluate yourself. We want to lead with health first. Do what we aspire to be.
Let's sing while we're waiting. I'm just kidding.
They're about to sing, yeah.
That was perfect timing because I'm about to open them all. So here you go.
All right.
Saved by the bell. I was gonna say button and lead us, yeah.
Oh, you don't want to hear me sing next time. Okay.
And Ingrid, it assigned you, but you should just be able to not go.
Hey there, can you hear me?
Hi, Bill. Yes, I hear you. Did you want to go back to your room?
Yeah, I got the boot. I don't know
You
what
got
happened,
kicked out?
but
John,
yeah,
if you're listening, which room were you in, Bill?
I was in 5.
Okay. I don't think I can send you there, but John can. I'll send him
That's
a.
okay. If not, I'll just
Sorry
You,
about
you
that.
sip a little
should
coffee.
just be able to rejoin. But oh, here we go. No, I do need to reassign you because you got
I
booted.
left the meeting and came back.
You said 5.
That's where I was, yeah.
All right. Well, here you go. Yep, he made it back. Zach, did you not get a notification?
I don't know. I don't.
I mean, I show
breakout rooms in session.
I show you assigned to a room on the. Do you have on the bottom of your screen something that says breakout rooms or an option that says more?
I see join breakout room.
So if you do that, you'll get about 5 minutes before they're done. That should take you to the room that you're in, or assigned to, I should say. And there he goes.
Yeah, I was wondering about him. I wasn't sure if he wanted to go, so I didn't say anything.
I thought the same thing.
Yeah.
Paste.
That was harsh.
All right, well. Was somebody brooded back into this room mid-sentence? That always tends to happen. But welcome back, everyone. I think we've all been magically transported back into our plenary session. Hopefully you got into some good discussion in the breakout rooms. It's always too short of a period of time. But now we want to do some report outs. And I think first we'll just go in order of the group numbers. So first, group 1 led by Matt Kroll, and then group 2 led by Kirsten Green. And if staff want to share your screen with kind of the high level notes, if useful, feel free to do that as well. So Matt's group. And just a reminder, it's like 1 or 2 minutes high level what was said. We of course have the notes to supplement the report out.
Sure, so group 1, we had a couple suggestions to add to the priority populations. One was age that we discussed earlier in the general group, particularly seniors and youth who have been excluded or maybe that aren't able to drive. We talked about adding religion. For instance, certain faiths require proximity to their places of worship. So that's something that I consider that isn't captured in the other categories in the left-hand column. And then we talked about nuances with renters and homeowners. Renters is a broad category. Some aren't vulnerable. Some homeowners are vulnerable, especially manufactured home, people that live in manufactured homes. We also talked about referencing the governor's definitions rather than reinventing the wheel. And then for the outcomes, talked a little bit about process, some comments that were echoed earlier. The idea of the rules should support is vague and doesn't talk about implementation. So consider using will require to be more clear. And then also making sure that we're not just taking a top-down centered approach for marginalized communities, but actually accurately reflecting their needs and priorities and policy decisions. We talked a little bit about not just focusing on public funds, but how to route private sector funds into achieving these goals. Let's see, looking at item C, requiring local public infrastructure investments in minority areas. Sometimes it's the loudest group that gets priority, but we need to make sure that those groups are centered. And so how to do that, requiring cities to use policies to influence, incentivize, and guide private sector funds as well to equitable distribution. And then we kind of got cut off on this, but we were talking about encouraging local code updates that encourage developments to reduce greenhouse gases. And I think that's something that we should include in our comments. But one example is mass timber buildings that current building codes don't incentivize, but that's a way to sequester carbon. So that's kind of what we discussed in a nutshell.
Great, thank you, Caitlin. And next, let's go to Kirsten Green's group, Breakout Room 2. And a reminder to just introduce yourself as well, as we're still trying to get to know each other.
This is Vandana. I was in this group with Vivek, Nancy, Kristen, Commissioner Lelack, Zach, and then a couple of other folks. Now my brain's not working very well. But, you know, at least in the first section, some of which the other group has already talked about, we talked about the need for a common language and possibly doing some training so we're all on the same page. Adding age-friendly sort of framework in our conversation, and that would include older adults and youth in this list. Using people first language whenever we discuss people with disabilities, which is already included in this list, but in other parts, in other materials, it wasn't. We spent a little bit of time talking about specifically about renters and being more expansive in the kind of impact that, you know, inequities have on renters. And then we touched on rural and what the council had recommended, but that even though we're focused on metropolitan communities, there are rural, you know, parts to some of these areas where where this will apply. So, and then we added age and ability in the second one, and then we talked about equitable outcomes. Generally, people felt like this was a really great list. One takeaway was, you know, can we either simplify or categorize things so that it's it becomes more cohesive and easier to track. One of the comments was that, you know, how are we going to really see when we're successful? We spent a little bit of time talking about housing and what was discussed in the larger group related to adequate housing, adding affordability, accessibility into that. I guess there was some feedback about adding green infrastructure as part of the outcomes. I don't know a lot about green infrastructure, but some folks do. So that was something to be added here. I'm looking at this and trying to see. Were there things that I missed? Oh, we talked about adding parks and open spaces as potential outcomes to add to this. Kristen, do you want to add to that? Or
Thanks. No, but I think that hit it. But any other group members have a correction? So we also want to bring forth, Nancy is calling us to bring forth the knowledge from House Bill 2001, 2003, that rulemaking, that robust rulemaking that just concluded. So pulling forth some information from those processes on the definition of what we talked about, adequate housing and affordable housing. Yeah, please.
One other thing that we did talk about was the idea of process. I don't see it reflected here, but Vivek had mentioned, you know, how H and I together represent this huge opportunity. It's really, oh, maybe that is there already, or is that something a little different, which is about process? Okay, that's all right.
But great ideas about categorizing and organizing. So I think it's a lot to hit folks with this list of 13. So maybe some categories could help. And then definitely, Vandana, did you already mention the need for training on terms? I think you did, yes. But we definitely need to get on the same page around language. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you all. So next, let's hear from Bill's group. So that's Oriana, and then group 4, Cody's group.
Yeah, so we had a really robust discussion that touched on some of the same things that other folks named. Namely, we uplifted the issue of age, youth and seniors both. We talked a little bit about the terminology we use, and that talking about marginalized communities can feel really, really passive in terms of like what the actual impact or harm that's trying to be captured in that terminology is, and that excluded can be more accurate to the ways in which communities have been shut out of decision making or oppressed can be more accurate in terms of focusing on like what are the harms or what is the result of that exclusion or the intentionality of that exclusion. We talked a little bit more about affordability and accessibility, lifting up that comment from earlier. And then in terms of the groups, I don't see this on the list right now, but we also talked about folks who are unemployed. And for example, the ways in which transit benefits benefit folks who are employed when that's tied as a benefit to a salary or a wage or a job. and tax credits and other opportunities, and making sure that we're ensuring a transit system that benefits folks regardless of their employment standing. We also talked about that specific last bullet point. Can you scroll up, please? Thanks. Yeah, the accountability is ensured to support achievement of racial equity, and kind of who is that accountability? And we tabled that discussion for, I think, later on in the conversation. But I think that will be an important thing to come back to in really thinking through what accountability means and who is holding that and to whom. And then going down to the outcomes, we also lifted up the process piece and talked in particular about valuing lived experience, not just statistics and data. And I think Francisco talked about like weaving those two together, that like a marriage is really important in terms of how we assess our outcomes. We got a little bit cut off in the discussion, but some folks raised some really interesting and important concerns, which is like, okay, what does process mean for reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And talked a little bit about the ways in which like who we're listening to about the programs and projects or policies we develop can really lead to improved outcomes and actually lead to better emissions reductions, because the people who are breathing the poor quality air are the ones who are most interested in ensuring that air quality improves and can see kind of what's happening in their communities on the ground in a way that folks who are removed in agencies or policy decision-making spaces don't always have. Let's see here, what else am I missing? Yeah, and we talked through just kind of highlighting that who are we listening to, and how are we valuing lived experience in this work? Like what are we seeing as kind of the important information that influences the decisions that we make.
Thank you, Oriana. And I think next we're going to Amy from group number 4.
Hi, thanks again, Amy, NAACP, Eugene Springfield, and University of Oregon. So I think I'm gonna kind of split this up based on like format and then the outcome. So kind of in regards to actually like the format of the document and the structure of the document, there are statements about the phrasing of the words, things like support and monitor. We should be using active words like lead or invest to connect to outcomes. And there was also a suggestion about separating process and outcomes. So including a separate statement about what the process of this looks like and separating it from the outcome statement. There was a suggestion to, shorten and condense the list just to make it a bit easier to get through. And I think that was it for kind of the structure of the document. Moving on to the outcomes. So we definitely want the outcomes to be more measurable, and including statements about who's responsible for overseeing these and who's accountable for them. A lot of kind of going back to the outcomes versus process, a lot of the outcomes are process-based. We're wanting to call out the barriers in achieving the outcomes and how do we support them, like via financial or educational means. There was statements about what is considered culturally appropriate. There should be an inclusion of that, and that can apply especially to housing. I'm thinking about what's not just affordable for people, but what kind of suits their lifestyles and abilities. That also applies to other resources like food availability for Indigenous populations and maybe other people from other countries. There was a statement about, again, about process, thinking about how we include the voices of historic communities in decision-making, and possibly looking to 17 principles of environmental justice laid out in 1991 by the National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And I think that summarizes most of it. And my group, feel free to let me know if I missed anything. But yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Amy. Really appreciate that. And then 2 groups left here. So group 5, Kevin's group, and then group 6, Evan's group.
Hi, I'm Ariel Nelson from League of Oregon Cities. Happy to report out on our group's discussion. I think there was definitely a lot of overlap with some of the really excellent points that folks have raised already. To add to that, if we're looking at the future state section, we had some language suggestions. It talks about access to reliable transportation, and our member of our group thought
well, we can't hear you anymore. At least I can't.
Oh, shoot.
Kevin, I wonder if we could invite Ariel to join by phone, which might take a minute, and then come back to this group. Is that be okay?
Ariel, are you back? Or
I'm
do you want to
here.
call?
I can hear you. I can hear you all. Can you hear me?
I think you're unfrozen. Yeah.
Okay, I just switched to my other wireless line. Hopefully that fixes it. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I was just saying, our group, I think, echoed a lot of the great points that folks have shared already. I can add under, can you still hear me? Under future state, that some of the language choice, there were some suggestions that came out. We'd like to aim for better than reliable transportation. Convenience and safety are also very important. We can do better than just reliable. Want to make sure the vocabulary there is really emphasizing access for all. Kind of in that same vein, on all persons and families live in healthy neighborhoods, consider adding safe as well. And then we had a lot of our discussion centered around the equitable outcomes section. I just want to echo what I think I've heard a lot of already, like making sure that we're defining the terms, so we're all on the same page. What does this look like in practice? How does this translate to implementation? I really appreciated, I think Amy shared a comment about some of these are more process oriented rather than an outcome. So I think that would probably help, really focusing in on that. Another point our group discussed was that access to resources is important. We need to think about feasible and realistic outcomes within the scope of this work, including defining roles and DLCD's purview versus local government resources and authority. Just how do these pieces all fit together? So we're clear on roles and expectations. I think that's similar to stuff we've heard previously. Similarly, F and G relate to collaboration with local governments. So we'd love to have a deeper discussion about what that looks like, and what those outcomes look like, feasibility and what's a realistic outcome. Similar discussion about how to operationalize outcomes. We think that some guidance, like a menu of options, would be really helpful to support local conversations and making sure that it's understandable at the local level. Again, access to resources is very important. Childcare, employment conflicts, and other barriers to participation. We want to make sure that those are considered when we're developing these processes. Want to have a deeper discussion on what we mean by inclusive and collaborative. And just along these same lines, examples will be really helpful for a lot of these pieces. So just looking forward to getting deeper into our goals around this language and what it means.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. And then last group, Evan's group, number 6.
Go for it, Leanne.
Great, thanks. And then if you wouldn't mind pulling up the notes, just in case I forget anything, that would be great. I'm Leanne. I'm with Ben Bikes and Allyship in Action. And I use she and they pronouns. Our group had a really great, robust discussion. When we looked at we are building a future where, there was a lot of conversation around that the local decision-making directly benefits people from historically marginalized or oppressed communities, but really that building a future piece should not just look at the benefits, but should be really, the process should be driven forward by those communities, and those communities should have power. And that's the future that we envision, and to speak to all of those pieces. And then under the the outcomes, I think one of the biggest takeaways for us was that having that laundry list, like groups 2 and 4 acknowledged, is that we might need to break these down and maybe categorize them, right? So there are some pieces that seem kind of based more in restorative justice, like what do we need to acknowledge about harms of the past? Some pieces are process oriented, some of them seem almost principles. And then that really allows us to see what are the actual measurable outcomes and what are the accountability pieces to drive that process forward. Because it seemed like if you take away some of those other pieces, there actually aren't that many outcomes. And so I think it would help even us guide that process a little bit. And then there was also a talk about equitable engagement, even within the context of this RAC process, right? So starting to make things accessible, like even the meeting notes, so that if people are taking these back to their organizations or back to their communities, that we have something that is actually accessible to folks who aren't super print culture, or that is understandable by someone with, who doesn't have to have a really high level of literacy to be able to talk about these pieces that we're trying to do, because we acknowledge that all of us sitting in this RAC, even though we have folks that are being represented who have been previously excluded, we still can't speak for everyone, and we have a relative place of privilege sitting in this virtual space together. So just to start bringing those accessibility pieces around equitable engagement into this RAC process as well. Did I miss anything, the rest of my team?
Thank you, Leanne. That's great. These were clearly very rich discussions, and really appreciate the report outs. And I think just to overall summarize, I'm going to miss a lot of things here, but in defining kind of the priority populations, it's sounding like the importance of terminology is critical. Words really matter, making sure that people are described as people first, and getting these terms right is critical. And you all also suggested a number of groups that might be missing in that list: youth, older adults, renters, homeowner versus homeowners, rural populations, unemployed groups. So just a number of additions there. And then thinking about kind of the future state and the equitable outcomes moving forward, I think there were really important suggestions. First and foremost, thinking about adding process, whether it's included in that outcome or as a separate statement, but engaging the most impacted folks need to be included in decision making, and the importance of acknowledging that lived experience is critical. And also heard that overall that the outcomes list structurally, making it simpler, categorizing it, condensing it would be really helpful, and including some stronger language, right? So some of getting away from some of the fluffier language and maybe some more required language, or just stronger language. And also heard about the importance of making sure that there's a tracking, that these are measurable. How do we measure success? And that it's important to draw out who's really held accountable and to whom. And also a lot of comments about kind of access to resources and distribution of funding. So really great to hear all those report outs, and appreciate that. And Kirsten, maybe just quickly to you, any next steps on this piece that you want to point out before we kind of take a break and head into our next conversation?
Well, thanks. I'm mindful of the time because I know everyone deserves a break. Speaking of human-centered process design, I think we would like a work group. We staff have great direction here. Cannot thank you enough, but thank you 40 times, and deeply. So we will try and take a next iteration with this great guidance, and do a doodle poll on folks that'd be willing to work with us. If there's, we're looking for about 10 folks, but if it ends up being more, it'll be just, the Zoom format, it'll be more. So please let Ingrid know in your, either in your survey. So Ingrid will be sending out a survey. So please just, if you're not going to do the survey, just respond and say, hey, I'd be interested in doing the work group. Or in your survey, go ahead and here's my comments, and I'd be interested in participating in the work group. So that would be wonderful for us, and we'll get that doodle pull out and scheduled the week of, ideally later in the week, first of the year, January 4th, or like on the 11th, so we can get it finalized before the packet. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kirsten. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and take a break. Staff, should we, we're a little bit behind schedule, but maybe still need a 10-minute break. Does that sound good?
7,
Looking
10.
at
The
folks
boss
for
says, Kevin says 10.
10 minutes. Okay, so let's get back together at 10:50 to resume. And at that point, we'll be talking about regional scenario planning. So feel free to turn off your video, but stay in the meeting so you don't lose your connection. Get on mute, and we'll see you at 10:50. Thank you. All right, welcome back, everybody. It is 10:50 on my watch, so I think we can go ahead and get started. And for the next part of our meeting here, we're going to focus on regional scenario planning. And so Cody Meyer will provide kind of an overview presentation, and then our hope is to have kind of a large group discussion on regional coordination, and Cody will explain a little bit about what that means. And then we will get into the breakout rooms again and talk a little bit about local community engagement and how best to do kind of local community engagement in this effort. So we'll frame those questions a little bit more when we get there, but I will turn it over to Cody to provide an overview of what we're talking about.
Great, thanks, Sylvia. Great discussion this morning, everyone, and glad to be here with you. My name is Cody Meyer. I'm a land use and transportation planner with DLCD, and I've been working in this program with ODOT and DLCD for about 6 years now. And before that, I've spent quite a bit of time working in California on some of this stuff as well under their program. Commissioner Lelack alluded to the 2018 rulemaking that the agency was doing. And I want to just give a little bit more detail on that. We don't want to kind of, spend too much time on it, but just to give an overview of, what that work entailed. That work really was not making significant policy changes on our greenhouse gas reporting program. So it was staff was undertaking the effort within the existing voluntary framework. So we weren't making any new mandates or anything like that. We were making a lot of technical fixes that clarified existing requirements in the transportation planning rules, that these requirements would go to cities and counties and not a regional body. Outside of the Portland metro region, there is no regional governance that we can kind of hang our rules on as a state. And one of the things I think that we're really kind of excited to pull from that effort was we worked with a subcommittee of planning professionals from around the state to develop some performance measures that local governments could use that would monitor actions to reduce both climate pollution and get at increased transportation choice. That is a main goal of the transportation planning rules, is to provide for, other modes of transportation besides the automobile. I think, at the point we are now in time, we've done a pretty good job. You can pretty much drive your car anywhere you want to go in this country. And we need to start kind of building out those other networks. So it's by no means we're going to just throw this down, but we do have a good starting place. And these were things that local government said, yes, we agree. These are things that we can report on. And these are an easy bar, and got to some of the outcomes that we felt like were important. But we definitely want to be refining that list. I've heard a lot about this morning, kind of, I get a sense that people are kind of chomping at the bit to go like, how are we going to measure outcomes? And I think that we're really excited about that too. So we'll talk about that a little bit more moving towards January. I think that's where we want to be going. There's also some just real technical work that happened to identify monitoring and enforcement mechanisms for our agency to use so we can have accountability. And that's a lot of the stuff that, is probably under the hood, and it's going to be really wonky, to be honest. So we'll pull from that, and you'll see it in the red line rules stuff. And, we're always happy to talk a little bit more about it if we want. So with that, next slide, please, Bill. Okay, so in the staff memo, I think it's on page 2, we kind of give an overview of what we're talking about today with this subject. And then on page 12, we just kind of give a write-up of like, why are we here today? And why are we talking about this subject in particular with the regional scenario planning? So really going back to the executive order, these are the 3 main items that the governor felt that these 4 agencies should work on. And these are commonly referred to as the Every Mile Counts agencies. So DLCD, ODOT, Environmental Quality, and Department of Energy. So one is we need performance measures. We're doing that with a group effort of these agencies to do kind of like state level performance measures. As I said, in January, I'm hoping that we can come up with some local performance measures to add to that. Number 2, make rule amendments. We need to have local plans going in the right direction. So that's what we're going to be talking about here today. And then 3, we think about rules, but we also think about a program. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about is assistance and money and funding and how to get people at the table. We have a very square hole in our administrative rules, and some of the stuff that we want to do, it's not going to fit in that hole, but we can do it as a program. And what we're learning from you all is how to stand that stuff up into a program and how to roll this stuff out. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is from the commission charge to the RAC. And I think Bill did a really nice job in the memo kind of on page 2 saying, here's the 2 boxes that we're talking about. Box number 1 is looking at specific land use and transportation regulations. And box number 2 is looking at just metropolitan areas. How do they meet our climate goals? And as the state, our climate goals are set at a region. So we don't have targets for cities, we have a target for a region. Next slide, please. Okay, so just looking at box number 2, we're going to kind of go down that rabbit hole today. We want to look at how do you develop, adopt, and implement a plan at a local level to meet a regional climate target? And then how do local governments report on progress towards that target? And so obviously what we want to be doing is putting an equity lens over all of this stuff. And we want to identify some equitable outcomes that come from these plans and integrate those too. So that's what we really want to be talking about today in our breakout session. Next slide, please. Okay, specifically from the commission, we've been talking about this and scoping this rulemaking for the last year. Very important to them that a desired outcome of this rulemaking is that we have plans that will meet our climate pollution reduction goals, and those are found in Division 44 of the administrative rules. Very wonky, I know, but that's kind of what we'll be doing. And so, as I said, next slide. Yeah, the metropolitan areas of the state is for this specific box, number 2, is where we're focusing. So these are just these 8 metropolitan areas, and these are identified by the census as, sorry, I'm a little nervous here today, staring at the computer screen, you guys. Metropolitan areas over 50,000 in population or more by the census. And so if you are a city in this area, you have specific obligations under the federal government to plan for regional transportation planning for federal purposes. Those are federal requirements, and those are federal agencies called the Metropolitan Planning Organizations. DLCD does not have authority over those organizations. We have land use decisions made by local governments in comprehensive planning that we can write rules for. So this work that we're talking about, it can be done by an MPO. We would accept it by an MPO. We cannot require it by an MPO. Next slide, please. All right. So just kind of a framework of where we are and where we're going. So today, talking about a concept, we want to talk about preferred outcomes, and we want to talk about how do we get measurement towards where we want to go. In January, staff's going to take this information. We're going to roll it up into redlined administrative rule language, send that out to you all. You can shoot at it, tell us where we got wrong, where we got right. We'll continue to amend that rule language. We're going to take a deep dive into performance measures. What are the outcomes we want, and what are the indicators of success that we want reporting from local governments to the agency? We're splitting up the scenario planning into 2 buckets, trying to keep it at a high level here. But so we have the commission identified that we want to have scenario planning done as a region for the largest metropolitan areas in the state. And in the interim, we need to identify ways for other regions to report on how they are achieving their targets. So we need to come up with, we're calling it kind of an alternative scenario, a performance-based planning approach, something we can pull on the lessons learned from the last 10 years to say we have a pretty good idea of where we want to go. And so in February, we will then kind of roll that out to you guys in a redlined administrative draft rule, take more comment. Then we're really going to pivot towards transportation system planning and housing and other regulations. And those are going to be a little bit more geared at the city level. And then once we kind of get through all that work, we realize that we're probably going to need to circle back and make sure that we are picking up anything that we've done to go back into this regional framework. So I know that's a lot. I'm trying to kind of give you the information you need to have informed discussion. So I'm open to questions or anything I'd missed during that. And just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll call on you.
Yeah, thanks, Cody. And I think what if anyone has any clarifying questions, Cody would be happy to answer those. So just raise your hand. And then we kind of want to get into a discussion on this regional coordination piece. But any kind of questions before we dive into our first discussion question? Okay. Not seeing any hands, but of course, you can continue to ask questions as they come up. And so I think kind of for our first conversation here, we want to focus on regional coordination. And here the department is interested in hearing your thoughts on how cities and counties can best work together to create a regional scenario plan, especially in places that don't have a regional government. And I'll be looking at Kevin Young to help. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I actually have a couple more slides to go through.
Oh, I apologize. I didn't know that. I was
just taking a quick pause to make sure that I'm making sense to folks.
I thought that was a little too quick. Okay, keep going.
I usually talk a lot faster, so yeah, I normally have got through it by now.
No, but Cody, keep going slow. Thank you. This is big stuff.
Okay. Well, thank you. So we'll get a couple more slides here, and then we will get to that discussion piece. So just want to arm you with some more information. As I mentioned, the department in 2011 and then in 2017, we did some technical work to fix them or to update them a little bit, is that we have greenhouse gas targets at the region level. They're not at the city level. So, you know, an individual city can't say they're meeting the target. It's set at the region. Our rules do apply to the region or the cities within the regions, not a region itself, except for in the Portland metro region, which has a metropolitan government. The federal government requires certain planning standards to be done if you are in a metropolitan planning organization. Every 10 years, the census will designate who is a metropolitan area. So we might get a new one this next year. And we know that we need to really align these things, because what the MPOs do in their regional work, they really roll up the work that the cities and counties are doing. And so we need to respect that. And we need to work within that framework. Next slide, please. Just wanted to give you a glimpse at, here are the targets. So we have targets set for the years 2040 all the way through 2050. These are in line with the STS, or statewide transportation strategy, and then the Oregon's goals to reduce climate pollution. As I mentioned, it's going to require regional planning to demonstrate consistency with these targets. Next slide, please. So we've been doing this work for about 10 years, you know, honestly, probably decades, because our state has, you know, been working on urban growth boundaries and a lot of other kind of progressive policies. But really what we've been doing in the scenario planning program is for 10 years, and we know what works. We know that we need active transportation, walking, biking, transit to be more available and to be safe. We know that the best transportation plan is a good land use plan, and these things need to be integrated. They're really highly, they affect each other a lot. We know that just one thing is not going to make you reach your greenhouse gas reduction goal. If everybody in the state drove an EV or an electric vehicle, we still wouldn't meet our goals. We have to do a lot of different actions and a lot of them. So there's a lot of work and money to do that work. Next slide, please. Okay, in the staff report you guys got, we have just the concept here of what the commission accepted our staff recommendation back in September, that this should be the scope to the rulemaking advisory committee. And so first is that for the largest metropolitan areas, they should go and do the regional scenario planning. We have a framework there that says that Metro has to do very specific regional planning. Everyone else has been voluntary up till now. And so we identified populations over 200,000, which would be Eugene, Springfield, and then Salem, Kaiser. And we'd be able to build on some of the work that has been done in some of those regions. In the meantime, we know that we have other regions. We have, that would be 5 other regions And we need to create some sort of interim requirement to demonstrate compliance with the targets. The governor wants us to make sure the plans are in line with the target for those metropolitan areas. So we're going to come up with a framework to help them out. The other thing that staff recognize is that we need a comprehensive program to measure how are we doing? What actions are we taking? Are they enough? And so I should back up here and say that a huge part of the programmatic element of this has been funding. This stuff costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time, and local governments don't have that money. So the state has identified a source of funding through ODOT over the last year in our work effort to support this. And within that bucket of money, this is what we can afford. And staff identified these 3 areas. All 3 of these would also include a really robust public involvement and setting a framework at the state level, but letting local areas speak to their own needs and have some flexibility in how do they get to those, the target or the performance for the different action areas. So today we're just talking about number 1 here. We're just talking about how do Eugene, Springfield, and Salem-Keizer areas do this kind of planning? And when that rolls out to the other areas, how will they do that planning? In January, we're going to be tackling number 2 and 3. So we're going to get a little bit of information here from you guys to help us scope out the performance measures. And then also that will kind of inform this bullet number 2 here. Next slide, please. So here's just a sneak peek. After a decade of working on this stuff, these are kind of the policy levers that we know reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And the devil's in the details. How do you do it? And how do you do it in an equitable way? And how do you get to these outcomes that we want to see in our communities? But these are the areas that we've identified through our 2018 work and through the statewide transportation strategy as the levers that we can use. And we are also open to other levers if we're missing anything here, or some of these, they don't make sense. And I'm always open if you want to send an email or have a phone call to, ask some questions about some of this stuff.
Cody, if you could just give one example of what a TDM, a transportation demand management program, could include. Is that like employer programs, or one example, just to demystify that for a sec?
Right, yeah, a good example would be an employer-sponsored transit pass, or a program that sends out information to households in a certain area. You could target it to let them know what their options for commuting might be. Like, did you know there's an express bus a quarter mile from your house coming in next week?
Thank you.
So those are just, kind of informational, or it could go all the way up to, providing a benefit. Okay, so next slide. I think now, Sylvia, we can pivot to the discussion question. And of course, I can answer any clarifying questions.
Thanks, Cody, and apologize for jumping the gun there. Yeah, so maybe first, and these questions kind of come straight out of the discussion worksheet, so happy to hear more thoughts after this meeting. But just to kind of kick things off, thinking about the regional scenario planning, wanting to ask how ideas for how cities and counties can best work together to create a regional scenario plan. I see a couple of hands up, so maybe Mary Kyle and then Cassie.
Thanks. So I have a couple comments that are all a little bit all over the place. So first, I appreciate Cody's description. I think that what was missing from it was that we already, you mentioned and listed a number of things that we know were the tools to achieve our greenhouse gas reduction targets and that are scattered in various plans. I think what's missing is the significant increase in all of those that have to be accomplished in order to meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets. And we know what that is. So I would like to see very clearly here, ODOT has already adopted their state transportation strategy for greenhouse gas reduction that includes basically the performance measures that we need to accomplish through integrating land use and transportation planning, including half of all new housing and employment development needs to be located in compact mixed-use walkable areas in these communities. and we need to double or triple our mode share split. So the things that have been happening so far fall far short, not just a little short, but far short, and that's been documented on that. So I think realizing the significant lift that needs to happen in these rules that we are going to be recommending adoption of needs to be front and center. And I don't think that MPOs are entirely divorced from a relationship with the state in which they can be required to do something. MPOs receive funding from ODOT, and the federal government already has a requirement for MPOs that if the state adopts performance metrics that must be met in federal transportation dollar planning, the MPOs have to meet those state performance metrics. And again, we have those in the STS and in the work we're doing here. So I think that the MPOs are not quite as divorced from that as we might sometimes think. In terms of the list of performance measures, housing was missing from that. In terms of what we've been talking about, adequate, well-located, affordable, appropriate housing. And then in terms of how can cities and counties best work together to create a regional scenario plan, these tools and performance measures that we're talking about are really implemented on the ground by cities and counties in their land use and transportation plans. But at the regional level, I think there's a lot of coordination, as well as looking at those systems that are of a regional nature, like transit systems, TDM measures, those sorts of things. So I know that was a little bit all over the place, but that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary Kyle. And Cassie?
Yeah, I just had a really quick clarification question. You mentioned the regional reduction targets by 2040, and I was just wondering if there has already been a baseline established and where we can kind of find more information on that.
Yeah, there is a baseline. It is from 1990 levels, and you can find more on our webpage at the DLCD. You can search climate change, or you can search DLCD climate targets.
Okay, thanks.
Cody, why don't you go ahead and put that in the chat, and let's also promise to send that out to the full group when you have a chance. I know you're facilitating, you're leading discussion right now, but those are known. And Cassie, thanks for asking.
Yeah, thanks. And Cassie, since you have the floor, any thoughts on some of the discussion questions we have here, especially as a representative of a city, just on regional scenario planning or the performance measures?
No, I mean, I don't have any off the top of my head. I'm not a planning professional, so I have probably a little bit more to learn on kind of what we've done in the past and what some of our challenges have been. My alternate is part of our MPO, so I'm sure he has great ideas. So I just have to check in with some of my team first.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, let's go then to Emma.
Thank you. Emma Newman with the City of Springfield. So City of Springfield participated in the scenario planning that was referenced back in at least 5 years ago, kind of wrapped up in 2015. I think to the first question of how can cities and counties best work together to create a regional scenario plan and to also implement the work that we're talking about, it's going to be key to building flexibility for each jurisdiction and how to implement tangible actions in a way that really aligns with the community visions and values. We collaborate really well with Eugene Land Transit District, ODOT, City of Coburg is also involved, all of our different partners in the region. And yet, I think that is so successful because there's flexibility for each local jurisdiction to determine the how. So I appreciate Cody speaking to the setting the framework at the state level and then letting local areas determine their own needs and the route or path to actually accomplish the why or the what that is set with that framework. So I'm really glad to see that reflected. I think, just from my experience sitting at the regional transportation planning table and having a role in helping our elected officials with the funding allocation process, we have passed through federal funds that come to our metro area. And those funds are being spent on biking, walking, transit, and some system preservation. I mean, in Springfield, you can come down here and see that our streets are just deteriorating. If we don't have well-paved streets, then it's hard to run transit buses along those routes. So we aren't expanding the system, but there's a severe funding shortage. I would love to, having looked in our transportation plan, have enough money to build out our entire planned walking and biking network. Just talking with teams from the library program last night, I asked all of them, what is your priority? If you could do anything for transportation in Springfield, what would you do? And every single participant said, fund and build our sidewalk network. Because there's so many places where sidewalks are lacking, and yet there's no dedicated funding source of how to actually accomplish that. And I have one question to wrap up, but I'll just note that the common theme of resources that was brought up at the beginning of this meeting is really, really important. Just last night, the Oregon Transportation Commission meeting that I listened into was pretty disappointing. The governor's executive order was referenced as a reason to not put more funding into the non-highway, aka walking, biking, and transit project categories. And we're looking based on that decision for the 24-27 time period at over 100 years to get the walking and biking network on just the state system built out. So it seems like there's a disconnect from the great conversations we're having here and the vision that we're painting and the actual resource allocation to make it happen. So 2 resources. I have a quick question regarding funding to implement the actual projects that need to happen to build the community we're envisioning. Is there funding available that goes beyond just the planning process? And what are we talking about if there is? And what dollar amount, what would that look like?
Cody, is that best to share with Amanda, since that initial funding is coming from the Climate Office? Emma, I think the short answer is that together we're working on putting that detail together. I believe it is currently just for the planning phases. Amanda or Brian or Cody? The sort of scenario planning level, deepening that and getting that adopted.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that. So this is Amanda Peets. I'm the director of ODOT's Climate Office, and I know Emma and some others on the call today. So the question is, what money is available? So right now, the commission has set aside funding for doing the planning work and kind of getting ready, less the implementation side of things. I think if we're conservative on our spending of the $4 million that we've set aside for planning work, we can roll that into kind of a grant program to actually get projects out on the ground. But primarily that money's been set aside for community engagement, for the technical analysis and the other work to support the outcome of this rulemaking advisory committee. So depending on the process that you all help to set, that could be less expensive, and we can roll that again more into the project side of things. What we also have to do is start looking at our investment program. So as Emma mentioned, the Transportation Commission just gavelled down yesterday on the allocation of funding. They did put a significantly higher amount towards active transportation than in the past. So it actually cuts that time frame from 150 years closer to like 75, which is still a super long time frame. They had an opportunity to go bolder and didn't take advantage of that, but at least it's a step forward. Other part of our work is to look across our investment programs and see how we structure those to better support some of these outcomes, whether that's our congestion mitigation air quality program, CMAQ, or some of our other investments to see what carrots in particular might be available to support areas that have a plan in place to reduce emissions, and how can we help to fund their projects. So that's part of the work mix. We haven't figured that out yet because we want to wait and see the direction that this rulemaking committee provides.
So I guess for the second question, perhaps something around actual resource allocation. I mean, if we're having great conversations and painting the vision, but not actually putting the money where our mouths are, then that's not going to produce the results that we're laying out for this process. Thank you.
Amanda, this is Kirsten. So Emma, you probably know this. I just came into the state a couple of years ago. I'd been in the private sector for a quarter century. long time and didn't know this, but I mean, it wasn't clear on these how all this works, but you know, the executive side, the governor's side, the state agency side sort of sets policy. We don't control the purse. That comes from the legislative side. And those are relatively free agents from what we're able to do on the executive side. So there is this relationship between the two, but it's they really are separate and related systems. So as we set up the program here on the executive side, really the resources will ultimately come from the legislative side. So I just want to set that as a base so that we don't get we don't solely focus on ODOT and existing resources. There's a long session every 2 years where the legislature reallocates resources. Obviously, we're state's struggling right now under COVID and also the wildfires needing significant. The governor's address, you know, she mentioned in her governor's budget just earlier this month addressed, you know, even this budget, as good as it is and as proud of it as she is, does not meet the needs, and we need additional federal government support. So just let's be mindful of the different sources, the different avenues, and who we need to be asking when. But there's obviously reason to think that a policy option packages or a suite of them in the 2023 session would be appropriate to continue to fund the work that we see coming forward here. Thanks.
Okay, thanks all. And a few more hands are up. I just want to also note that after kind of this conversation on regional coordination, we also do want to get into breakout groups to talk about engagement at the local level. So definitely want to hear some more comments here, but just know that that's coming too. So let's hear from Noel and then Zach. So Noel, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question that's sort of non-monetary based, or it's more of an observation. So Mary Kyle started out well with a good example where ODOT, part of the fundamental thesis of what they were putting out is pertaining to housing and where zoning and where we densify, which is to say it's not in their bailiwick. And so I'm just calling attention to how different bureaus or different state agencies like to say they're going to get towards the goal vis-a-vis areas that are outside of their domain, outside of their turf, because it's a lot easier to promise other agencies will do the work that'll make your work easier than it is to actually do your own work and to regulate in that way. And so the beauty of our land use system is that we do have a state DLCD, et cetera, that can kind of play cop, can kind of like say, no, like Portland Bureau of Transportation or Salem Bureau of Transportation, you can't just assume that the planning or the housing bureau will do densifying. So I'd like to, like, that's kind of an answer for number one and number two about how things can work together before it's even a money question. It's simply like recognizing these siloed turfs and the brokenness and how we could make a lot more progress just by that function alone. Thank you.
Great. All right, thank you. And Zach?
Oh, thank you very much. Just want to add to the thought process that I'd like to see as cities go about all their planning efforts and population forecasts and buildable lands analysis and housing needs analysis, all those things. I'd like to see the default become regional planning solutions, and I know that's a tool that's already in the toolkit, but I'd like to see that push forward as more the default. See that be the stronger method. You know, we often have sort of a bigger city that has some rural areas next to it, but like to see those all outlying cities get engaged. And so cities aren't planning for their own city future in a vacuum. I think infrastructurally it makes sense, make sure the sewers can get to everyone that needs a sewer and water and things like that. But like to see sort of how outlying rural cities can connect with bigger cities in the UGB growth and expansion process that everyone has to go through. And then I'd also like to see that spawn conversations around connectivity of those cities and make sure people can move from those cities safely in alternate methods. And then a bigger discussion around technology and access to technology as to make cities more resilient. That's it.
Thanks, Zach. And then Caitlin and Oriana. Caitlin, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a comment on item number 2. So just echoing what Mary Kyle suggested about using metrics and recommendations, basing metrics on what's already recommended in the statewide transportation strategy. And then the Metro's scenario plan has some good metrics too, but I think that in terms of equity, where possible with data, those metrics need to be broken out by priority population. So, you know, what percentage of African Americans or renters that have access to frequent transit within a quarter mile and stuff like that. So cities can understand where the disparities are and where the progress they're making on relative to each of those priority populations is occurring, or where there needs to be more focus. Yeah, I think that's basically it. I'll add some more details to that thought in the survey, but linking up metrics specifically to the priority populations. Oh, and then assisting jurisdictions in finding that data if they don't know where it is.
That's great. Thanks, Caitlin. And Oriana.
Yeah, so I apologize if I freak out the planners here with this suggestion, but I was thinking about like, why are we planning from a regional perspective? And what does that actually mean, like from a livability or a day-to-day for people experience perspective? And I know this is something that is taken into account by planners, but what if we thought more from the perspective of like keeping communities connected? And where this comes up for me is, in particular, just speaking as someone in the Portland metro area right now where displacement is happening, and that metro like regional transit system is really important, in particular for like Black communities or Indigenous communities who are being displaced from like inner Portland to East Portland to like Gresham or Greater Clackamas or Washington County. And that's happening for BIPOC communities broadly, but most significantly for like Black and Indigenous communities. What would it look like to really be tracking like how communities are being displaced, or like for rural communities, how communities are spread out and how people are actually experiencing our transit system, where they're going, who they're connecting with? Because I think sometimes when we talk about planning, we're talking really, really broad, and especially when we think about greenhouse gas emissions and how do we like reduce miles traveled and all of these different things. But when we think really, really broadly, we're not connecting with the actual experience of the system. And I know this is something that is taken into account in planning, and I've never been a city planner, so please apologize if this is something that's already happening, but I think it's a framing and a process thing. Like, are we putting like the people who are experiencing the system first versus the system itself first? And this goes back to the question that was asked in our small group about like, why does process matter? And this is a good example of, I think, maybe a way to have better outcomes in starting with the communities, in particular communities who are being displaced or who are traveling long distances because they don't have good transit services to meet with their community or to take care of job or agriculture related activities in more rural parts of the state. But if we really thought about like, are the services that we're providing really meeting the needs of how people are traveling and what their experience of this system is? And I think going back to the Portland metro area, a good example is it's really hard to move from north to south in the Portland metro area. It's much easier to move kind of from east to west, or like really centered on the city center and not necessarily how people are being displaced. So sorry if that was a little bit scattered or didn't make sense. I'm happy to clarify for anyone maybe in the chat or someone else, but I think it's a framing thing. When we just talk about region, when we just talk about system, we lose the context of the people who are using the system and the experience of the system. And in particular for communities who are marginalized or excluded or oppressed, we're losing the needs that come out of that. So I think if we were more rooted in the community experience of our regional transit systems or our regional planning, we might have better outcomes in terms of really meeting the needs of how people need to use the system. And in particular for creating opportunities to use transit, if transit is really going the way people are moving, that reduces the miles traveled in cars. And if we're providing good like local like microbuses or other like rural transit opportunities that are really scoping the way that people are moving through their communities, that's another opportunity to reduce miles traveled by cars.
Thanks, Oriana. And I think that really leads well into kind of the next discussion on local community engagement and what's happening at the local level. And we do want to have a little bit of time in breakout rooms. I want to look at staff to see if you want to frame that a little bit. You know, we're getting into breakout rooms to ask you all your thoughts on best practices around engaging community voice at the local level. But just looking at staff quickly to see if you have a little bit more framing. Yeah, Kirsten, go ahead.
I can take this, but others, defer to other staff as well, but it's really like, what is working well? So we really want to follow success. There's been a lot of hard work done in different communities to help build capacity in governments to open up and make available protocols and practices for better hearing community voice. So if you've experienced, if your community, your city's trying something, we really would love to hear about that at this breakout. Because we want to build up from that and help sort of export those models and see if we can, provide what best practices can we provide, and then also be funding over time. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirsten. So in a moment, John will break us into our breakout rooms. I think they're probably it's the same staff leaders. I don't know if the participants are the same. I think we'll find out when we get there. And we'll ask that we have a conversation until about 11:45, and then we'll have time for like 30-second to 1 minute report out so that we can be sure to end the meeting on time and be respectful of everyone's time here. So John, why don't you go ahead and do your magic, and we'll all be in breakout rooms until 11:45, and then come back for just really brief high-level report outs of maybe 1 or 2 key things that you all talked about. See you all soon.
John, this is Rob Interfeld. I haven't been sent to a breakout room.
Hey Rob, Joshua Scove here. Neither did I.
Me neither. This is Amy.
We could just have our own Eugene
Hey, Amy.
breakout.
Yeah, it is a Eugene breakout room. It's like we stayed behind in the main room.
Hey Amy, I'd love to have a call with you or something sometime if you're still there.
Hi.
I'll try to send you an email. Can I email you there's like a environmental justice email address at NAACP. Does that work for you? It seemed like it had your name next to it on the website.
Yeah, do you have that email?
Well, I don't have it in front of me. But
I'm breaking up here.
I can get it from the staff too, or if at DLCD, and I'll shoot you an email.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Okay,
that
cool.
Sounds good.
All right, great. Thanks. Nice to meet you.
Hello. I don't know if I can be put back into my breakout session.
Hi, Lee. Hopefully John is there and he can do that for you. Just hold tight.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Do you recall which room you were in, Lee?
I think it was 3.
All right, I'll pop you back in.
Okay, great. Thanks.
they have a relationship with, whether it's the organization, it's individuals.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope that we are all back in the room here and that you had productive discussions during your breakouts. We're going to get into our lightning speed report out round here. And so again, just going to hand it over to the groups in order. So beginning with group 1 led by Matt, and then group 2 led by Kirsten, and just kind of like a couple of highlights from what you heard during your discussion in 30 seconds to a minute if you can.
I think Caitlin has got a point or two. I don't know if she's made it back here.
Sure, I can go. We talked about a lot of stuff, but a couple of points. We talked about methods of reaching people, like culturally specific newspapers and school districts, churches, and then making sure amenities are provided to allow people, so providing food and where possible, gift cards or bus passes and childcare, language assistance to make it easier for people to participate. And then the need for jurisdictions to develop inventories of organizations within the community to work with and build relationships with them. And then to kind of do their homework ahead of time so they're not asking community leaders the same questions over and over again, but they understand what's already been produced and what information is already out there. And then bias training so that jurisdictions, when they're doing outreach, can kind of interact with people in ways that are appropriate and effective. That's a real quick summary.
Thanks so much. And group 2.
Okay, I've been trying to consolidate here for Cassie's going to report, and I'm just put it on the screen here if I can remember how to share. Pressure is on. Okay, so Cassie, I tried to kind of make it there up at the top. Thank you for being willing to report on this end or anything else.
Yeah, perfect. So we talked a lot about how just using a greater variety of tools, like in order to engage people, we need to use lots of different modes of engagement. And the move to virtual open houses and surveys and things like that has been really helpful to broaden engagement, but we also need to be doing in-person types of input too, and that it should just be a little bit more planners going to people. So we talked about experiences doing tabling events at places like grocery stores and neighborhood associations. We talked about how a lot of this kind of engagement just requires a lot more time resource on the behalf of planners. And like we said, it's important to get out and about and really spend time in the community. We talked about providing payment or some sort of reimbursement is really important to be able to get input from people who can't afford to just take time out of their workday. And we talked about a couple of different models people are using to do that, such as different equity panels. Lane County Climate Action had examples of allowing people to participate in specific areas of interest. And then we also talked about it's important to actually invite people in. So people that are kind of outsiders to your process need to be kind of really specifically invited in, not just kind of expected to show up. I think that was it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And then let's go to group 3. And I know Oriana is reporting out for that one. And then group 4, Cody's group.
So in our group, we had some really good feedback and thinking from folks who are doing this planning work. First, in just talking about how much effort is involved in really reaching community effectively, and how much creativity and flexibility of using different kinds of tools, especially during COVID time, different platforms to work better for different communities. But that really effort has to go in, and that flexibility and creativity has to be applied. Then just want to show kudos to Paige West from the Rogue Valley Transit Authority, who really shared some thoughtful feedback on how this work has been put into play by a regional transit authority organization. And some of the work that's gone into master planning and how it's kind of focused more macro, but not necessarily been as effective on the neighborhood or micro level, and that ways to address that is really addressing who is missing in the service process. They found that they were missing 30% of households, especially older adults, and we mentioned seniors earlier as a priority population that we want to make sure we address equitably in this work. And that there's a lot of times there's not the density in residential areas to really be transit viable, so that there's a disconnect between what can be achieved and what data exists, and then where the need may be, or what is possible. And it's difficult to get the lived experience information when you're not able to do kind of that outreach or gather that data effectively. So then it's difficult to meet performance metrics. So there's this like big disconnect problem that happens at that really micro kind of neighborhood level. And then one thing that was also mentioned was that, I don't remember what STIF stands for, so apologies there, but that some of the committees that do this work don't have BIPOC representation. And I think that's probably a problem across the board in most spaces where these decisions are being made. And just want to lift up the issue of like stipending that I think Cassie mentioned, and how important it is to resource people for their time, that you can't just have like seats to bring people in, but recognize that there are certain barriers that come up, especially for communities who have just a lot pulling them in different directions and have lower incomes, that accessibility services, not just stipends, but also childcare and interpretation, can increase equity and access. That community-led processes are really important too, that relationships and like who's a trusted messenger can be a good way to fill in data gaps, because it's not always government that's able to really reach community, even if they work as hard as Eunice Kim has been in the city of Salem, kind of doing that outreach that Salem mentioned in our small group. But that community can really be a trusted messenger and help also think about creative processes to get around the fact that it's just really difficult to
people to come out and engage. And Alex mentioned kind of that sometimes bringing a tractor in rural areas, a little bit tongue in cheek, but also genuinely like people need a hook. They need to see that short-term value for the long-term planning work.
Yeah, thank you, Oriana. Great recap of a very rich discussion. 3 more groups. So Cody's group, then group 5, Kevin, and group 6 with Evan as leader. So Cody's group.
Great, yeah. So Mary Kyle, you've been nominated by one of your group members since we didn't get to do a report out unless someone else wants to volunteer quickly. Yeah, it was Randy.
Okay, Randy's
Mary,
chuckling, so I think he nominated me. Okay, quickly, we talked about how to ensure that venues should be fully accessible, both physical and in terms of communication accessibility, such as Braille and sign language, as well as offering a variety of different ways in which people can participate in these processes, not always by going to a place, but the outreach should be where people are or where they would they'd be comfortable going to. Maybe it's a community center, their place of worship, et cetera, but also so they can participate from home. And providing food and childcare and stipends and things like that are also a critical part of it. Asking local leaders to participate and to identify other local leaders who can participate in contributing or being the messenger for these. Be clear with those who you're asking to participate in what the outcomes are that we're getting to here in greenhouse gas reduction targets. Let's be clear about that and not vague, and don't establish early on reasons why we can't get there or why it's challenging to invest more money or make policy changes. That's just going to discourage the public from participating, or they may walk away thinking it's not going to really make a difference. Instead, we should all embrace these outcomes and figure out how to get to yes, both in policy and investments. The public doesn't really see these siloed agencies, nor should they, and because they're not. We're all part of this same Oregon. And let's see if I missed any. Bring in our elected officials, communicate with local and state elected officials who have relationships with community members, both so they understand this early on, because they may be making some funding decisions at the end. If there's anything I missed because I didn't know I was going to be reporting out, anyone in my group?
Great, thank you, Mary Kyle. And group 5, Kevin's group.
All right, I'm just going to go ahead and report out for my group. It's just in the interest of time. So we had a good conversation. A number of things we talked about. One example was mentioned of an I-5, cities along the I-5 corridor, and some trying to do transit coordination with Chariots, which is a local group there in that region. Many of the people who live in those small cities in Aurora and elsewhere are commuting to Salem and Portland, but the lack of predictability makes transit usage pretty hard. Things like Metro's app kind of helps with that, but predictability is key. Well, that then launches us into, gee, they do it a lot better in Tokyo, and I don't think any arguments here. An interesting idea there is that in Asia, many areas, I guess, they plan the transit first, then build the cities on top of that. Obviously, that hasn't been the paradigm in this country, but it's a thought. And then we talked about some specific applications that folks were using to get input from non-typical participants. One is a proprietary product, Co-Urbanize is the company that does things like putting QR codes on things, providing online input opportunities, and specifically making those opportunities available at the locations where the planning is in question. So at transit stops or public gathering places or what have you. Interesting idea there. Of course, focus groups are used by Port of Portland. LTD has regular conversations, well, not very regular conversations on refining engagement, but every 2 decades or every decade is not frequently enough. So there's a need for more frequent feedback loops
Kevin, I just wanted to draw your attention. It's 11:59. I'm sorry.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, that's probably enough from me. I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Thank you.
No worries.
Yeah.
Okay, final group 6.
Yeah, all right. So I won't cover everything that our group talked about, but a few of the key things. A group member, and there were a lot of nodding heads, made the point about urban and rural divide and urban and rural communities and spaces, and the importance of including engagement in that area. There was a discussion of the need to, on that stipends point that's already been made a couple of times, is paying for the participation by experts. The stipend is for that, and defining that word expert to include lived experiences and knowledge of the community, since it's certainly a kind of expertise that we're seeking and valuing. That it really takes time to build understanding and relationships, and so going out to the community's existing meetings enough times to build relationship and understanding. So not just when something needs to be presented or some piece of information needs to be gathered, and recognizing that those community meeting participants, their time stretched thin too, often thinner even than the government staffers. But there might be an opportunity here. To the extent some of those are happening online, it's actually less difficult to go to the meetings now. Examining the success of other communities. What did they do? Local governments and communities. So for example, maybe looking at Minneapolis and its middle housing process. And I'll say one last thing. Again, about prioritizing that need to be with the same group of people for a longer period of time to really build understanding, and building understanding in both directions, and recognizing that it takes time to work through existing traumas.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks to everyone for these fantastic report outs. I know we're past our meeting end time. I'm just going to kick it back to DLCD for just quick next steps, and then we'll get a brief closing from Commissioner Lelack. And if folks have to go, do hop off. We want to respect your time, but next steps from DLCD.
All right, Bill, if you want to put up that last slide, I just want to note we'll be putting out a survey following this meeting. That was a really rich conversation. Please, there were a lot of things we talked about in our groups. I'd love to get more specific information from you all. And then lastly, this is next steps in terms of our next meeting. You've seen this slide already. Cody's reviewed it. So in January, we'll be bringing you draft planning rules. We'll be talking about performance measures and alternative scenario planning concepts. So that's probably enough from us at this point.
Just a quick reminder, if folks want to serve on the work group to frame up those equitable outcomes screen, just let Ingrid know with your survey results. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And a reminder, the next meeting of this group is January 25th. And Commissioner Lelack, any final closing thoughts?
Well, thank you. I just want to really appreciate everybody's really valuable contributions today. It's just been extraordinary, just as the first meeting was. And I hope you all know that you are really directing this process. We debrief after this. Your comments matter. They're going to be reflected in the next documents that you see and in the rules that we create together. So I just hope you know how important your contributions are and how much we value them. I really want to thank our consultant team, our staff, which is DLCD, and I failed to recognize ODOT at the start for such a great meeting today. Please continue to submit your written comments, fill out that survey. It's really important. I know I've thought about it, a lot of things that I'd like to contribute, but we just didn't have enough time for everybody. And that's always going to be the case. So submit those comments in writing. And the last thing, and I really appreciated Cody's term wonky earlier. There's a lot of technical information that we're going to be discussing. Please don't hesitate to contact DLCD or ODOT staff with any of your questions. I live and breathe this stuff on the commission and in my day job, and I still have so many questions. And I know so many of you that are new to this process are going to have those as well. So please ask. Thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing all of you in 2021. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thanks, everyone. See you all January 25th. Meeting adjourned. Bye.
Bye now.